from the Secretary of State's position you could do to try to hasten the day when we could find a path forward? People didn't think you could find a peace deal between Ireland and Northern Ireland either for hundreds of years, and yet youngsters in Ireland now don't remember when there was a problem. What might you bring to the table on that?
Well, and I'm glad you put it in the context of hundreds of years. I know that was just euphemistic, but I think it is indicative of how conflicts like this take a long time, and sometimes it takes another generation to have a changed view. Oftentimes we just have to try and make the situation as stable as possible and limit the impacts on people that are living there now. The Palestinian people have suffered a lot under their own leadership in many cases as a result of there not being more progress made. So I think it has to be a shared aspiration of all of us that ultimately is resolved. The issues are long-standing, and I think it's the State Department's role to try to create an environment that brings parties together to want to find a way forward. I can tell you under the conditions today, it's extremely challenging to do that. But that has to be the aspirational goal. And to your example, sometimes it takes a different generation that's not carrying all that baggage of the past with them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely. Thank you. Senator Young.
Thank you. Mr. Tillerson, from the outset, I just want to thank you for the level of candor you've shown throughout this hearing. You've engaged on issues, you've answered questions, you've been adept at times, and I want that from our nation's chief diplomat. The only request I would make is that they don't coach that out of you. Should your nomination move forward and you become our next Secretary of State, which I suspect you will. So thank you for that. In your prepared statement, you write, quote, defeating ISIS must be our foremost priority in the Middle East, unquote. And you also note later that defeat will not occur on the battlefield alone. We must win the war of ideas, something we've already discussed a bit here. I couldn't agree more. We have to win the war of ideas. We can kill every single irreconcilable, as you know, who subscribes to this poisonous ideology that those who join ISIS do, and yet we're still going to have a problem. The organization will reconstitute itself, and so we really there's something deeper we need to tap into, a deeper taproot. In your prepared statement, going back to that, you indicate that if confirmed, you will ensure the State Department does its part here in this war of ideas. Now, based on your presentation for this hearing, what is your assessment of the State Department's current performance in the war of ideas? And why don't you make your comments specific to our effort against the Islamic State?
Senator, I'm not sure I could articulate what the current State Department is doing in the war on ideas, other than the advocacy, the public advocacy, condemning this type of brutality. I think your observation that even if we defeat ISIS in its caliphate in Syria and Iraq, they will morph to something else. And I think this is where we have to be truthful and realistic in our conversations with the American people. You know, terrorism has been a part of the world for centuries. It is the nature of man, the unfortunate nature of man. But what we have to do is certainly limit it and suppress it to a level that is no longer a threat to our national security or a threat, an imminent threat to Americans or all other people in the world who value human life.
So in a recent hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee, D&I Clapper indicated that he believes the U.S. might reestablish the United States Information Agency to fight this information war and to advance our efforts to defeat, radical extremists or terrorists, however one chooses to brand them. Do you agree that this would be a good idea?
Well, I think, as I indicated in the exchange with Senator Portman, we have got to up our game in terms of how we engage in both the digital communication world, because that's where ISIS has been very effective, and other radical groups, Al-Qaeda and others, have been effective in using the digital communication space to spread their message. We've got to become more effective at encountering that messaging and countering that message. But I also take Senator Portman's observation that it's not all digital. There are other communication mechanisms that are effective broad-based in terms of how do we communicate, particularly in those parts of the world that could be susceptible to these messages.
For the record, for the benefit of my colleagues and also for your benefit, I'll note that I'm just coming from the House of Representatives, and in my final 2-year term, I introduced legislation so that Congress could assess whether or not the Countering Violent Extremism initiative within the Obama administration was working or not. Is it working? I was prepared to be briefed in a classified setting, yet the administration came out fairly strongly against our efforts to exercise oversight. So my hope would be that I can work together in a bipartisan way, and in the next administration, we will have the tools to assess whether or not we are improving and work with the administration to ensure that we are, in fact, killing the terrorists, countering violent extremism, most importantly, making sure that this effort doesn't reconstitute itself moving forward. Mr. Tillerson, back to the prepared statement. You write that China has not been a reliable partner in using its influence to curb North Korea. I know we've discussed this before, slightly different tack here. Just an open-ended question here. Why do you believe China has not done more?
Well, I'm aware that under the most recent version, I believe, of the UN sanctions, which have been ratcheted up with each of North Korea's provocative, whether it's been a nuclear test or the test firing of a missile, and I indicated earlier that China is 90% of North Korea's trading, exports, import trading. So they really do have complete control over what sustains the government of North Korea. A big part of that is the sale of anthracite coal across the border, and the sanctions did speak to that sale. And I think that's an area where I think we have to hold China accountable to comporting with the sanctions that were put in place by the UN, and just we have to call people out on it when we view they're not complying.
So there might be an opportunity to exploit there with respect to the reliance on anthracite coal to ensure that the missile and nuclear programs, they comply with international law and our security interests.
Well, under the UN resolutions, North Korea has already violated those on multiple occasions with both the nuclear tests, including the one most recently in September, as well as their firing of tests.
I'm going to interject, which is D.C. talk for interrupt. But so what would you suggest to the President of the United States he considered doing to wield more effective influence over China's decision-making on North Korea? In 10 seconds or less, please.
Well, it does involve a concerted response from our allies as well, Japan, North Korea, and making sure China understands, as part of this whole of China approach, that this is an important element of what they can do to strengthen our relationship, or they can do to weaken our relationship with them.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for sticking this out. Mr. Tillerson, I know this is a long day. I want to come back to the issue of human rights, because I do worry that there are going to be a lot of human rights advocates, a lot of people who are hoping that the United States maintains its leadership role on maintaining and promoting human rights around the world, who are going to be very worried by some of your testimony here today. Asked about the 3,500 extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, you weren't yet ready to say that you had enough evidence to call that a violation of human rights. Similar answer on Saudi Arabia, and a similar answer with respect to the war crimes perpetuated by the Russians inside Syria. So I guess the simple question for you is this: if if you're not ready to say today that what's happening in the Philippines is a human rights violation, despite the fact that the president brags about killing people without trial, or the denial of rights to women in Saudi Arabia as a named human rights violation, or what's happening in Syria as a war crime, can you maybe give us a little bit of a sense of what countries today you would consider to be violators of human rights, or how you are going to make judgments about where the U.S. pursues human rights violators and where we don't? Because I think it'll be a surprise to a lot of people coming out of this hearing that you aren't ready today to call President Duterte a violator of human rights, or to call what's happening in Saudi Arabia a named violation of human rights under international law.
Well, I think somewhere in your question there, Senator Murphy, was in fact the answer. I'm going to act on factual information. I'm not going to act on what people write about in the newspapers, or even what people may brag they've done, because people brag about things that they may or may not have done. I'm going to act on the facts, and if confirmed, I'm going to have access to a lot of information that I don't have access today. It's just my nature to not prejudge events, or prejudge and make conclusions, or conclude that someone has in fact violated this norm, or in fact now meets the standard to be labeled this, until I have seen those facts myself. That should in no way suggest that if those acts that you've described are backed up by the facts, I would agree with your labeling and characterization. I'm just not willing to do that on the record today, because I've not seen that information. So please don't confuse that with my standards are no different than yours.
But just let's take Philippines for an example. I mean, I don't know that there's anybody on this committee that would deny that there are extrajudicial killings happening in the Philippines. That's been widely reported. Our embassy has reported it. The president himself talks about it. What more information do you need before deeming the Philippines to be a human rights violator? What's happening there is a massacre that's there for everyone to see.
I'm sure the committee has seen a lot of evidence that I've not seen. I'm not disputing your conclusion. You're asking me to make a judgment on only what I'm being told. That's not how I make judgments.
So what information in that case would you need? Who would you need to hear from?
I would want to see the factual basis behind the statistics and the factual connection as to who is committing those acts.
Well, we don't. A lot of times, the factual evidence is reporting by objective observers on the ground. I'm not initially sure you're going to get a videotape of an extrajudicial killing. So, oftentimes, the evidence is the objective reporting we get from sources on the ground inside a place like the Philippines.
I will rely on multiple sources to confirm what I am being told. That is, you can blame it on me being an engineer. It's just the engineer in me that I deal with facts, and then I analyze, and then I conclude. And I'm sure there's a lot of credible information out there that I simply haven't seen.
This is a question that often gets asked of members of Congress to judge their view of politics and conflict in the Middle East. It's a pretty simple one. Do you believe that the Iraq War, not the conduct of the war, but the war itself, was a mistake?
I think I indicated in response, I believe it was to Senator Paul's question, that I think our motives were commendable, but we did not achieve the objectives there. We did not achieve greater stability. We did not achieve improved national security for the United States of America. And that's just, the events have borne that out. And at the time, I held the same view, that I was concerned, just as I was concerned before the decisions were made to go into Libya and change the leadership there. It's not that I endorsed that leadership, but that leadership had the place somewhat stable, with a lot of bad actors locked up in prison. Now those bad actors are running around the world. So it's just a question. It's the question of, it isn't a question that our ultimate goal has to be to change that type of oppressive leadership. It has to be, though, that we know what what is coming after, or we have a high confidence that we can control what comes after or influence it, and it will be better than what we just took out.
But which, in this case, which motives are you referring to that were commendable?
I think the concerns were that Saddam Hussein represented a significant threat to stability in that part of the world and to the United States directly. And so I understand that people were looking at information that was available to them, information that's not available to me, at least at this point. And so I'm making this comment as a casual observer.
One last question going back to Russia. You said in answered an earlier question that you wouldn't commit today to the continuation of sanctions against the Russians for their involvement in the U.S. presidential election. But could you make a commitment to us today that if you deem sanctions to be the inappropriate policy, that you will recommend and argue for a substitute response for the interference in U.S. elections? Will you argue for a U.S. response, even if you don't believe sanctions is the right policy?
Yes, yes. And all I've read is, again, the unclassified portions, but it is troubling. And if there's additional information that indicates the level of interference, it deserves a response.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to follow up, our embassies in countries have pretty massive capabilities that are well known. If in the Philippines, for instance, our embassy there assessed to you with very high confidence, since you're not going to be able to be on the ground checking things out yourself in a 70,000 person organization, 75,000, and you're going to have to rely on people that, as you did as an engineer and certainly as CEO of a company, if they assess that extrajudicial killings were taking place, that would probably be enough evidence for you that, that he was a human rights violator, would it not be?
In all likelihood, it would.
Just to follow up on one other thing, I know this committee passed very strongly in a bipartisan way, and now it's been through multiple iterations of appropriations and now an authorization, a bill to end modern slavery, to work in partnership with others around the world. And I say this because I visited a place in the Philippines where much of that is occurring, and thank you for reminding me. But do you plan to continue to support the effort that's been authorized here and has been appropriated towards to work in conjunction with the world community to end one of the greatest blights in the world today, and that is 27 million people in the world being enslaved more than at any time in the world's history?
I think it is part of America's moral clarity and our values that we must speak out, and not just speak out, but take action to cause countries that are allowing this to go on or facilitating it worse to cause them to change that. And I know that this is a particularly passionate issue to yourself and other members of the committee, and I want to enlarge it to human trafficking at large as well. Slavery and human trafficking have to be addressed, and America has to lead in this particular area.
Thank you so much. Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tillerson, thank you very much for your candor and your respect you've exhibited for the committee and the process. We're proud of your nomination and commend you to the Senate. I'm going to ask one question, and then I'm going to waive the rest of my time so we can get a little rest. One of the important roles of the State Department, I went back to the State Department before, is some of the soft power. And part of our soft power is our ability to solve problems that nobody else can solve. Most recent example, Ebola. When the Ebola outbreak took place in West Africa, it was the CDC that created the mechanism by which we actually stopped Ebola. And now we have a vaccine that will prevent Ebola, which is a great victory for humanity and a great victory for the process. The money that was done to treat the initial patients from West Africa was a special appropriation of the United States Senate and the House to create an emergency fund to deal with Ebola. During the same period of time, the State Department had referred a Lassa fever patient to the CDC, to Emory University to take care of, and which they did. There was no funds available for that Lassa payment, and to this date, Emory has not been reimbursed for that payment, for that treatment. My question is, it seems to be a good time for us to look at the CDC, which is the heart of the solution, and create an emergency fund reserve where we have an amount of money available to the CDC secretary that they can immediately go to use for an emergency like Ebola or like Lassa fever. I'm going to work to try and establish that this year, and I hope as the Secretary of State, when you're confirmed, you'll work with me to do that.
I look forward to that, Senator, and engaging with you on it. I think you're right. The CDC's response in the Ebola outbreak was remarkably well managed. I would make an observation, because all of this at some point gets to somebody's got to pay for all this. And in examining how the World Health Organization did in these outbreaks, I think what it exposed was some deficiencies within the World Health Organization as well, that they were not able to respond. And that's where normally, this was an outbreak occurred in another part of the world, they should have been the first responders to the scene. But as you point out, CDC as well as other U.S. assets had to be put in to those countries to address that. So I think it's worth an examination as we're considering CDC's role. It's worth an examination of how that interfaces in these types of outbreaks, whether it's Ebola or the Zika virus. How's that interface working with the global health organizations as well?
Thank you very much for your time, and congratulations on your nomination.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tillerson, do you agree with President-elect Trump when he said, quote, "It wouldn't be a bad thing for us if Japan, South Korea, or Saudi Arabia acquired nuclear weapons"?
Senator, I don't think anyone advocates for more nuclear weapons on the planet.
Donald Trump said it would not be a bad thing. Do you agree with that or disagree with it?
I do not agree.
You do not agree. Would you commit to working vigorously to ensure that no additional country on the planet obtains a nuclear weapons capacity?
Senator, I think if confirmed, it is one of the vital roles for the State Department to play in working in the National Security Council in an interagency way has to be the pursuit of nuclear nonproliferation. We just simply cannot back away from our commitment to see a reduction in the number of these weapons on the planet.
Okay. President-elect Trump recently said on Twitter that, in his view, the United States must, quote, expand its nuclear capability. When warned that this could trigger an arms race, he replied, "Let it be an arms race." Do you agree with President-elect Trump that the United States should welcome a nuclear arms race with Russia or with China? Would that be a good thing for the United States?
Senator, I think as we're pursuing nonproliferation and we're also pursuing the enforcement of important agreements like New START, that we have to also approach those from a position of strength. I think in the context of some of the quotes that you're running through here, the President-elect has also indicated a commitment to ensuring that the level of nuclear arms and capability that we are going to maintain under agreed treaties, that those capabilities must be maintained, and that from time to time that means we've got to renew them and bring them up to date and ensure that they are capable. Otherwise, we now have an asymmetric arrangement with people we're negotiating with.
Right. That's at odds with what he has been quoted publicly as saying, so I just think it's important for us to hear you take a position that, in fact, negotiations towards reducing the nuclear threat rather than having a new nuclear arms race is much better for our country and the global security. If you are confirmed, will you commit to protect the rights of all career employees of the State Department, so that they retain their right to speak with Congress?
As pursuant to an open and effective dialogue with Congress, would encourage that issues are put on the table for discussion with the Congress, yes.
You just had, I think, a great conversation with Senator Isaacson about global health issues. And one of our great achievements over the last couple of decades has been the establishment and investment in PEPFAR and U.S. leadership in the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Millions of lives have been saved and health infrastructure has been built in the developing world. Could you discuss your view of those programs and your commitment to strengthening them in the years ahead?
PEPFAR is just really one of the remarkable successes of the past decade or more, obviously begun under President Bush. And I think what's notable about PEPFAR is there are measurable results. Very well managed, very well targeted at getting at those three diseases. I think it serves as a model for us to look to as we're thinking about other ways in which to project America's values, project our compassion to want to solve these threats that are in other parts of the world that, by and large, we're not threatened by a lot of this here in this country. Malaria eradicated decades ago, TB well under control, AIDS, great treatment programs available to people. Projecting that into other parts of the world is a marvelous way to send the message of the compassion of the American people, that we care about people's lives all over the world. So PEPFAR is a terrific model to look at in the future as we think about other areas that may be useful for us to put additional programs in place.
Now, I'd like to move on to another global health issue as it impacts the United States. And again, this is the opioid epidemic. It's now been transformed into a fentanyl issue. In Massachusetts this year, in New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen's home state, 3/4 of the people who died in 2016 of opioid overdose died from fentanyl. And if it was occurring at the same rate across the country as it did in Massachusetts in 2016, that would be 75,000 people a year dying from fentanyl overdoses. Now, the way this is coming into America is pretty much the chemicals come in from China, they go down to Mexico, and then they're trafficked in out of Mexico into the regions of the country. Senator Rubio has a similar problem in Florida. We need to elevate this issue, Mr. Secretary, to a much higher level of importance in our country. The terrorist that's going to kill Americans on the streets of our country are the terrorists who are selling fentanyl. It's the Mexican and Chinese operatives who are funneling this into our country. That is the terrorist fear in the hearts of Americans. Can you talk about how strong you intend on ensuring that the State Department takes in terms of actions to tell the Chinese and the Mexicans how serious we are about this threat, this existential threat to families all across our country?
Senator, if confirmed, this will require an interagency approach, both in terms of applying many of the tools that have been used in terror financing elsewhere to track the flow of money, attempt to disrupt on both ends of that. Because I think it's one thing, we can send the Chinese a message, but it's another then to put in place the mechanisms, whether it be working with Treasury and other parts of the interagency process, to disrupt the flow of these materials and these drugs as well. Clearly, we have a message to project to China, but I'm also clear-eyed about China just suddenly say, oh, okay, never mind.
A wall across our southern border will not keep the fentanyl out. It's going to take much tougher action if we're going to save, ultimately, 2 Vietnams per year of deaths inside of the United States from that one drug. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Brasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your patience in staying with us. I had just a couple questions to follow up on some things that you've been asked already. A little earlier, you were talking about the efficiency and effectiveness of PEPFAR, and that government can at times do things well. The American public also knows that government is full of waste and fraud and abuse. You saw some of it in the private sector, and you'll see it in government. And I just want, with the kind of debt that we have as a nation, to know that you're committed also to, when you see it, to eliminating duplication, eliminating redundancies, and do what you can to try to address this incredible debt that we have.
Well, Senator, I'm obviously very good. It's just in my nature to look for inefficiencies and to streamline, and that will start, if confirmed, it'll start right there in the State Department itself in terms of assessing the organization structure of the State Department. I know as part of preparing, I've looked at organization charts from a few years ago to organization charts today, and I've noticed there are a few more boxes. Now, some of those may be for very good and valid reasons, but also it appears to me that new issues which have been added may rightfully need to be placed back into the mission and integrated into the mission itself, because it appears to me we've got some duplication, but it's not only about saving the American taxpayers' dollars and spending them wisely, it's also about the delivery on the issue. If we've got it dispersed in several places, we're probably not dealing with the issue very effectively either, because there's lack of clarity as to how does this issue integrate into the mission's obligations and what we're trying to achieve in the various missions of the State Department. So I just give you that as a simple example because it was so obvious to me when I began to look at the chart. So I know there will be opportunities to streamline things with the objective primarily of being more effective in terms of how we carry out the State Department's mission, making sure people understand what they own, having clarity, line of sight to who's accountable, and then out of that, I think will come we'll naturally going to capture some efficiencies and cost savings.
Another topic that was discussed was human rights, and as we travel around the world, we talk to leaders around the world who are concerned about security in their nations, economic growth in their nations, and somewhat human rights, but perhaps not to the degree that we would like to see that commitment. And these are people that we have interests with in terms of our own global security. So as Secretary of State, how do you balance engaging these countries in terms of trying to protect their security, as well as the economic aspect, as well as protecting and focusing on human rights?
Well, Senator, I take the view that it's never an either-or choice we make. I think as it's been said, our values are our interest, and our interests are our values. So regardless of what we may be dealing with, our values are never not right sitting on our shoulder in full display on the table. I think the real question you're trying to get to is how do we advance those values, though, against other priorities at the time. And I did, and again, just speaking in an honest assessment in my opening remarks, acknowledge that from time to time, our national security may have to take the priority. It doesn't mean our values were deprioritized. It doesn't mean they're not still as important. It doesn't mean they're not right here on our shoulder with us. It's really, I think what you're asking is, how do we project those values to another country in a negotiation in a way that they begin to move closer to our values? That is always there, and it is never an either-or choice.
And then the last thing I wanted to get to was the issue of energy as a master resource in the way that Putin uses it as a political weapon. And one of the things we're seeing now is this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The pipeline between Russia and Germany that the United States has been working closely with our European partners with respect to that. And this is something that we've had bipartisan support on. Looking across the aisle, Senator Shaheen, Senator Murphy have signed a letter with me and with Senator Risch and Senator Rubio, Senator Johnson, because of our concern with the ability with this pipeline to deliver more energy and make Europe more dependent upon Russia for energy. It also bypasses Ukraine and impacts the Ukrainian economy as well when it runs directly from Russia under the Baltic Sea directly into Germany. Several European countries have raised the concerns that this pipeline would undermine sanctions on Russia, increase Russia's political leverage over Eastern Europe. And could you give us your assessment of something in which there's actually a lot of bipartisan agreement on this panel with regard to?
Well, energy is vital to every economy the world over, so it can be used as a powerful tool to influence, kind of tip the balance of the table in one party's direction or the other. So it is important that we are watching and paying attention to when this balance is upset. The greatest response the United States can give to that threat and is the development of our own natural resources. The country's blessed with enormous natural resources of both oil and natural gas. And I know the Congress took action here in the recent past to approve the export of crude oil. We now have exports of liquefied natural gas. The more supply, more U.S. supply, which comes from a stable country that lives by our values, we can provide optionality to countries so that they are not cannot be held captive to a single source or to a dominant source. That's a physical response to that issue. I think from a policy standpoint, it's engaging with countries to make sure they understand they have choices and what those choices are. And what can we do in foreign policy to help them gain access to multiple choices so they're not captive to just one or a dominant source.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your willingness to serve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank you. This has been a very long process, and you've showed a remarkable amount of poise and equipoise and endurance. So thank you very much. I'd like to pick up on something that Senator Shaheen was asking you about, which is just issues with our Muslim allies around the globe as well as Muslim countries. You've been really in resonating with my spirit pretty strong in talking about the Muslim faith. You even called it, as I wrote down, when you said it, the great faith. And it shows a level of respect and deference that I'm sure will serve you well as Secretary of State, should you be confirmed. What I worry about is a lot of the rhetoric coming from the President-elect and others it really does undermine often our relationships with a lot of our allies. When I was traveling through the Middle East in countries like Jordan, for example, I was surprised that people at the highest levels of their government were directly concerned about the rhetoric coming from individual leaders in this country. The President-elect has said that he would consider Muslim Americans being required to register in a government database. I just want to ask you directly, you don't support a Muslim registry, do you, for people coming into this country based on religion?
Senator, I think in response to that question, I do not support targeting any particular group. If a registry of some sort that's broadly applied to any person entering the country that could present a threat.
So, sir, I'm sorry to interrupt you. My time is short. Let's just use specifically the NSEERS program, the National Security Entry Exit Registry System. I introduced legislation last week to eliminate that potentially. And under the Bush administration, there were about 25 countries registered. All of them were Muslim countries that were in that NSEERS program, except for one, which was North Korea. That was then the policy of the Obama administration was to zero out that registry. Is that something you would support? The NSEERS mechanism is still there, and how would that affect our ability to deal with countries that we're working so closely with, such as Jordan, which was my example?
Senator, I appreciate the question. I'm not familiar enough to be able to address it specifically. I'm happy to get back to you with an answer, though.
No, sir, I appreciate that. How does it affect, in your opinion, our ability to work with Muslim countries? For example, when people like General Michael Flynn has publicly called Islam a political ideology, not a religion, saying that it's like cancer, and writing that fear of Muslims is rational. That can't be constructive to our foreign policy, to our diplomacy with key countries in Southeast Asia, as well as the Middle East.
My experience, Senator, has been the best relationships in which you can make progress on tough issues is built on mutual respect of one another, which then leads to hopefully mutual trust, just as we want to be trusted as whether we're Christians or we practice the faith of Judaism or whatever our religious faith may be. And in this country, we have the freedom to practice that in any way we want. We want to be respected for that as well. But that relationship has to be built on a mutual respect for each other and not a judgment about one's faith.
Sir, I'm really grateful, not that I'm surprised at all, but I'm grateful for you putting forth those very important values. Could you answer me this? What do you think it does to our enemies' ability to push forth more propaganda about the West or incite more radicalism when you hear these evil terrorist organizations? What do you think it does to their recruiting efforts when rhetoric like that comes from the highest levels of leadership in our country?
Well, I think these radical Islamic factions that we've been talking about, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, they have broad networks, obviously, that they're putting in place. And that's what we've got to disrupt. We've got to disrupt their ability to reach large numbers of people who could be persuaded. And that's what I have spoken to earlier with new tools to advance our ability to do that.
Clearly, sharing intelligence with other Muslim majority nations, cooperating with them, creating those relationships that you said are so important is important to counter ISIL. But if you're insulting and demeaning their very faith, not only does it make it probably more difficult to deal with your allies, but it might even incite more radicalism, potentially, correct?
My expectation is that we're going to be able to re-engage with our traditional friends and allies in the region, not just in the Middle East, but I think, as you pointed out, there are large Muslim populations in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, other important countries in that part of the world where we have serious issues of common interest as well.
Again, there's much about our conversation privately that I appreciate, and as much about your testimony that I appreciate as well. One thing we discussed was just how important USAID is when we were together. I have real concerns now, having been out and around the globe, seeing the powerful impact the USAID is making for really asserting human dignity. I really worry that its budget has been cut. The base international affairs budget, which includes funding to state and USAID, has been repeatedly cut about 30%, adjusted for inflation, since fiscal year 2010, despite the fact that across multiple bipartisan administrations, there's always been a broad agreement that supporting both USAID and the State Department is a moral, economic, and strategic perspective. I just want to just hope that you will be, especially, I've read a lot about the way you ran your private business, streamlining and the like, but I hope that a priority for yours is a more robust USAID program. Is that something I have, could you give me reason to hope?
Well, I think, I hope what you're after is more effective programs with better use of the taxpayers' dollars, and to the extent we are good at that and we have even greater opportunity, then we should seek additional funding. But there will be a complete and comprehensive review of how effective we are with the dollars over there. USAID, as I said, is an important part of the projection of America's values around the world. We're going to have, I think there is a joint strategic plan that is required between the State Department and USAID in fiscal year 2017. That's going to be a perfect opportunity for me and those who will be working with me, if I'm confirmed over at the State Department, to take a comprehensive look at the effectiveness and what are our ranges of opportunities out there that might argue for greater funding. So I want to be effective with the program and make sure that as we are using the taxpayers' dollars, they're delivering a result that we're proud of.
And that's something I respect. I was a mayor, a chairman was a mayor. We know that spending more money on a problem doesn't necessarily mean that you're dealing with it more effectively. But if you do have effective evidence-based programs, investing more resources is a strategic as well as a human rights advantage. Sir, I'm a low man on the totem pole, and I'm done with my time. I do want to say this to the chairman.
Well, you had an extra minute this morning, so go ahead. You're high man on the totem pole now. You have the mic.
If only people told me this committee was so magnanimous as it is. Sir, I'm just going to use my last few seconds. I'm not sure if we're going to have another round. We're not. My ranking member is not. So I just want to just...
If by agreement with others, if I could, there's been, I think, a request to all members asking. I know there's some members that want to go another round, and we're going to make that available
I've expressed
to them today.
my thoughts to my ranking member, and I'll wait for his instruction, but in the few seconds I have left, I just want you to know that this is probably one of the more important positions on the planet Earth, the one to which you're nominated for. It's not just about it is obviously always looking for America's interest and strategic advantage, but it also It's about American values, values of human rights, values of taking care of poor and marginalized people. And I expect that you, at some point, will be confirmed. I look forward to working with you to asserting those values of human dignity as well as American interests abroad. So thank you, sir.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, before you call on the next witness, because for my members, there are some additional questions that members who have asked second rounds want to ask, and we're going to try to be able to give you the time. But it is possible if we all cooperate, we might be able to complete this hearing this evening and not go into tomorrow. So that's what we're trying to do. Obviously, we have to complete it by 6 o'clock because we have business on the floor at 6 o'clock.
I saw the look of disappointment on Mr. Tillerson's face. As I understand it, Senator Rubio will have additional questions. Senator Menendez, Senator Shaheen has a little bit. For those members who, Senator Risch, so we may be here tomorrow, but it looks like we're going to try to finish this evening if everybody can cooperate. And again, if that's not the case, as we all know, we're perfectly willing to come back tomorrow. We're really trying to accommodate the members.
And I appreciate the chairman. He's been very open about that, and it's been very helpful. We also have some members that have not had their second rounds yet. We know that.
Yeah. And now to Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, Mr. Tillerson, thanks for your willingness to be patient and answer the questions as you have with candor, and appreciate your willingness to serve. One thing we didn't talk about this morning in my questions was the Middle East. And I know you've had a lot of experience in the Middle East, particularly you've done business in many of the Arab countries. We talked about this a little in our meeting, but this relationship we have with Israel is a special one, of course. It's a cornerstone of our strategy in the Middle East. They are our greatest ally in the Middle East, the one true democracy. I want to talk to you a little about your views on Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship. One important issue for me, as you know, is this issue of boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the so-called BDS movement, which is a global movement targeting Israel. I've been concerned about this for a while, introduced some legislation on it. In fact, Ben Cardin and I have not just introduced, but passed legislation in this regard to try to push back against the BDS forces. Recently, of course, with the consent of the Obama administration, the UN Security Council passed this resolution condemning the settlements and demanding Israel cease all activities in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, is the way the resolution reads. I think this will no doubt galvanize additional BDS activity. And so here's my question to you. Would you make it a priority to counter boycott, divestment, and sanctions efforts against Israel, make sure Israel is not held to a double standard, but instead treated as a normal member of the international community?
Yes, I would.
Any preliminary thoughts as to how you would do that?
Well, I think just by raising it in our interactions with countries that do put in place provisions that boycott whatever elements of activity or business with Israel in their country, that we begin by highlighting that we oppose that and just expressing that view, and that those countries need to understand that it does shade our view of them as well then. One of the things that would, I think, help change the dynamic, obviously, would be if there were a change in the dynamic regionally. Today, because of Iran and the threat that Iran poses, we now find that Israel, the U.S., and the Arab neighbors in the region all share the same enemy. And this gives us an opportunity to discuss things that previously, I think, could not have been discussed.
Do you find more support among the Sunni countries in the region for Israel as a result of that new dynamic?
I don't want to speak for them, Senator, but I think clearly there's much more sharing going on between the leaders of those countries as they confront this singular threat to the whole region.
That's my sense, and I think it's an opportunity. On BDS, we do have legislation that ties trade negotiations to dismantling BDS, and would you support that legislation? It's law of the land, and as we conduct trade negotiations, would you support using those negotiations to help dismantle the BDS efforts in those countries?
from the standpoint of the State Department's view, if confirmed, I would advocate for that position as well, recognizing there's other agencies that will really have the purview over that.
What attitude do you take toward the UN initiatives relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Is it your intention to press the Palestinians to resume negotiations with Israel rather than seeking to negotiate through international bodies such as the UN? What's your position on that?
I think, as I've expressed in answers to a couple other questions, I don't want to be brief because I realize we're trying